purpose of this video is to review steps to successfully treat shoulder revision rotator cuff repairs utilizing an allograft augmentation. The patient has sustained a traumatic fall and re-injury following a previous rotator cuff repair. In anticipation of extensive thinning and damage to the native rotator cuff tissues, an allograft acellular dermal matrix will be placed arthroscopically over the revised repair of the supra and infraspinatus tears. This procedure will be performed in the lateral decubitus position. The patient is in the lateral decubitus position and the bony landmarks of the shoulder have been marked. The Dionix camera is placed in the standard posterior portal, while a 4.5 mm Dionix shaver is utilized in the lateral portal for debridement of the greater tuberosity. Subacromial scar is removed from the superior rotator cuff tissue. The camera is now in the lateral portal in the subacromial space, and the rotator cuff and scar has all been debrided. 2 margin convergent sutures have been placed. An all dilator is introduced just lateral to the acromion bone at the articular margin of the humeral head within the footprint of the greater tuberosity. A 5.5 mm helicoil anchor is then introduced into the bone in order to establish the medial row of the rotator cuff repair. The medial suture anchor sutures have been passed and are now tied using a distal locking sliding knot. The awl is placed a second time in the lateral footprint, and then the helicoil anchor is introduced. Note that it is gently tapped into place. The anchor is then introduced to follow the awl. Three number 2 ultra braid sutures are placed in a horizontal mattress fashion just lateral to the myotendinous junction of the rotator cuff. Note that the sutures are of 3 different colors: a white one, a blue one, and a black and white suture. All 6 suture limbs are shuttled to the anterior cannula. An acellular dermal matrix patch is prepared on the back table. The patch is dabbed dry and a marking pen is utilized to mark the bursal side of the augmentation. The marks are made for orientation. Clamps are placed on the patch in each corner in order to provide stretch of the material. A ruler is used to size the patch to an appropriate size of 3 by 3 centimeters. Clamps are then replaced a second time at each corner to make the second cut. The ruler confirms the size of approximately 3 by 3 centimeters. The camera is located in the posterior portal, and a 10 mm cannula is placed in the lateral portal. Horizontal mattress sutures that were placed medially are now shuttled out of the lateral cannula, starting with the most posterior black and white sutures. Note that each stitch is kept in place to avoid entanglement and to preserve orientation with regards to the patch. A clamp is placed on the black and white sutures around the posterior cannula to orient the sutures. The blue sutures are then retrieved next. The posterior blue stitch is retrieved first, followed by the anterior blue stitch, and then the two are clamped around the humerus in order to maintain orientation. The anterior blue suture stays anterior to the arm, while the posterior blue suture stays posterior to the arm. The white sutures are retrieved next through the anterior portal and strategically placed around the blue cannula and secured with a stat. Note that the most anterior suture in the subacromial space is placed anterior to the blue cannula. Direct orientation of each suture limb as it correlates to its passage through the rotator cuff is maintained to avoid entanglement. The patch is then brought over to the patient with a clamp on each corner. The patch is kept from touching the skin. A straight needle is used to shuttle the sutures orienting from the medial rotator cuff through the medial portion of the patch augmentation. Care is taken to maintain the orientation of the sutures as they were previously passed. The sutures are sequentially passed from posterior medial to anterior medial through the patch. The final white sutures anteriorly are passed with a straight needle. The blue center sutures are both threaded through the knot pusher without being tied. The clamps are removed from each corner of the patch and the suture tails are tensioned. The patch is then introduced into the cannula laterally using the knot pusher with the blue sutures. The remaining sutures are also tensioned as the patch is introduced in order to avoid entanglement. The sutures may need to be tensioned several times incrementally during the delivery of the patch. The patch is now delivered with the medial set of sutures passed. Final tensioning of the sutures is performed. The anterior white sutures are brought out anteriorly through the blue cannula. The anterior white sutures are then tied medially. The black and white anterior sutures are then brought out through the anterior portal once the white anterior sutures are tied in order to remove them from the lateral portal. The blue middle sutures are then tied through the lateral portal. The final anterior blue and white sutures are then tied through the anterior cannula. In order to make the patch lie flat to the native rotator cuff tissue, arthroscopic needles are introduced laterally through the deltoid into the patch. A mallet is used to impact the needles into the bone for provisional fixation. A second needle is impacted in place through the patch centrally. Micro adjustments to the patch may be made with the arthroscopic needle prior to impacting it into the bone. A third and final needle is impacted in place to fully secure the patch laterally. From this posterior viewing portal, the needles are in place and the medial knots are tied next to the myotendinous junction of the rotator cuff. Viewing through the lateral portal with the arthroscopic needles in place, the patch is fully attached medially and the needles are in place laterally. Radiofrequency marks are placed lateral to the patch in order to anticipate the location of the footprint ultra implants. A posterior lateral viewing portal has been added. A suture limb from each knot tied medially is retrieved through the lateral portal. Care must be taken to work around the arthroscopic needles during this retrieval process. The 3 medial sutures are then passed through the footprint ultra suture anchor, and a clamp is placed on the anchor. A footprint ultra awl is introduced and placed into the bone. The sutures are then tensioned and the footprint is impacted into place. The central arthroscopic needle is removed in order to get full tension on the sutures as they are pulled laterally. The camera has been moved to the lateral portal. The remaining sutures have been retrieved through the posterior lateral portal. This allows for excellent access to the posterior location for the second footprint ultra anchor. The sutures are passed through the footprint ultra. The awl is impacted into the bone. The final footprint is then put into place. The sutures have been tensioned and the final patch augmentation is secured.